So, before we get into tonight's story, I just want to take a second to address where I've been, because I feel like I owe you all an honest explanation, rather than just showing up like nothing happened. In December, this channel got demonetized for inauthentic content, and honestly, that hit hard. Not just because of the monetization side of things, but because it made me stop and actually think about what I was doing here, and whether it was something I was genuinely proud of. And the answer was that I needed to make some real changes. So I've spent this time figuring out what I actually want this channel to be. And here's where things are going. I'm moving into a new format, original horror stories, written by me, no AI slop, no recycled content, nothing that's going to waste your time. Real storytelling. I'll be posting 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And eventually the old content is going to come down. All of it. Clean slate. I know that's a lot of change at once, but I'd rather be straight with you about it now than just quietly disappear and reappear without explanation. Tonight is the first one. It's a story set on the Oregon coast, based on real places, real history, and one very simple detail that I could not stop thinking about once it got into my head. Now, let's dive into today's story. My name is Eryx Caldero. I'm 26 years old, and I shoot coastlines for a living, or close enough to a living that I've convinced myself it counts. 4 years of driving Highway 101 north and south, pulling off at unmarked turnouts, hiking through coastal scrub with a camera bag that's too heavy, and boots that are never quite waterproof enough, looking for the places that haven't been photographed to death yet. The Oregon coast gives you those places if you're patient. Hidden coves, basalt sea stacks at low tide with the fog sitting on them like something breathing, and the ghost forests, which are exactly what they sound like. Ancient trees buried by earthquakes and tsunamis and slowly given back to the surface by the same ocean that took them. I love this coast in the specific way you love something that doesn't care about you at all, that would kill you without malice if you stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. I want you to hold on to that, the fact that I loved this place, because I think it matters who's telling you this story, and I think it matters that the person telling it to you used to feel safe here. I first heard about the Neskowin Ghost Forest when I was 19 and had just bought my first real camera. It's about 15 miles north of Lincoln City on the Tillamook coast. And what it is, stripped to its simplest facts, is this: 2,000-year-old Sitka spruce stumps buried under the sand for centuries that the ocean started giving back in the winter of 1997. A series of brutal storms hit that stretch of coast and eroded enough of the beach that the stumps came up. These ancient barnacle-covered things rising out of the surf at low tide, like hands reaching up through the floor. Scientists think a massive earthquake along the Cascadia subduction zone buried the forest back in 1700, that the land dropped all at once, and the ocean rushed in and drowned a stand of trees that had been alive for 2 centuries in the span of a few hours. Some of those stumps are so large you can stand inside the hollow of them. The wood is black with salt and age, packed with mussels and anemones, and the small crabs that wait out the tide in the pools that form in the hollows. When the tide goes out and the morning fog is still sitting on the water, and you're standing in the middle of it, these 2,000-year-old things rising around you out of the sand, It looks like a place that remembers something it isn't allowed to say. I went back to Neskowin every summer for 4 years. I never got tired of it. I was there in early July, about 8 months before everything I'm going to describe, shooting the stumps at golden hour on a minus tide, when I met Kieran. He was sitting on a piece of driftwood just past the Ghost Forest, with a worn field notebook open on his knee, not writing, just looking at the water. He was a few years older than me, maybe 30, with the kind of quiet that felt chosen rather than natural, like someone who had learned over a long time that most words aren't worth the breath. We started talking the way you do on a beach, where there's almost nobody else around, easy and unhurried. And he told me he was interested in what he called the unmapped places, the sections of the Oregon and Washington coast that appeared in old naturalist records and survey documents, and then seemed to vanish from the historical record entirely. Places documented once and never followed up on. He said the coast was full of them, locations where someone had been, written down what they saw, and then the thread just ended. No further expeditions, no publications. Just a set of coordinates and a description, and then silence. I liked him. He was the kind of person who made you feel like whatever you were saying mattered. And he talked about the coast the way I thought about it, as a place with layers, with history pressed into it like sediment, things buried that had not finished being buried, and things surfacing that hadn't finished surfacing. We exchanged numbers before the light died, and I drove back to Portland thinking about the conversation more than I usually think about conversations with strangers. He texted me 3 months later. He said he'd found something and asked if I wanted to see it. He'd been going through old field journals at a university archive and found a reference to a beach about 40 miles south of Neskowin, documented once in the early 1900s by a naturalist whose name I won't use because I spent months tracking down his surviving family, and I don't want to bring them into this. The journal entry described a small crescent beach hemmed in by basalt that did not appear on any survey map the naturalist could find. He described the water there as having what he called a reflective quality, meaning the ocean seemed to behave differently than it should. And he described sitting on the beach with a sensation he found difficult to write plainly. The impression, he said, that the beach was studying him in return. He wrote down rough coordinates, called it a place of profound stillness, and then published nothing about it. The beach didn't appear in any of his subsequent work. It didn't appear on any aerial photographs from the following decades that Kieran had been able to locate. For all practical purposes, it didn't exist. Kieran said he wanted to go look for it. He asked if I wanted to come and if I knew people who might. I said yes, without thinking about it. I'm still not sure whether that was something I chose, or something that had already been decided for me. I invited 5 people. Kieran brought 1. That's how 8 of us ended up driving south on a Friday in late August. 2 cars, 4 hours from Portland, heading for a section of the Tillamook coast that, according to every map any of us checked, was nothing but solid rock and dense scrub. I need to tell you about the others, not just their names, but who they actually were, because what happened to each of them is specific. And it was specific because of who they were, and I think that matters. Eryx Bale had been my closest friend since the first week of college. He was 28, finishing a master's in environmental studies, and he was the most thoroughly skeptical person I have ever known in my life. Not cynical. That's different. Eryx genuinely believed that every strange thing had a rational explanation, and he approached unexplained phenomena with the patient, almost affectionate curiosity of a man who enjoyed the process of taking things apart. He ran a podcast about debunking outdoor legends, the kind of show where he'd spend 3 episodes methodically dismantling a story about a lake monster or a forest disappearance. And he was good at it because he never mocked the people who believed the stories. He just liked finding the seam where the explanation lived. He brought his audio recorder everywhere, a good one, professional grade, because he'd been doing field recordings for the podcast for 2 years. And he said, you never know when something useful is going to happen. His recorder was running the whole drive down. Thalra Venn was a third-year geology PhD student who had the kind of observational precision that made some people uncomfortable in the way that very still water makes you uncomfortable. The feeling that there's more going on underneath than the surface shows. She could look at a cliff face and walk you through the last 10,000 years of what had happened to it. She was quiet in conversations, but not absent from them. The kind of quiet where you always had the feeling she'd already thought about what you were saying 3 steps further than you had. She and I had worked together on a project the previous year, documenting rock formations on the coast near Cape Perpetua. And she was the best field partner I'd had. Sable Mirek ran an outdoor survival channel that had somewhere around 400,000 subscribers, and she documented everything she did with a fluency that seemed almost involuntary. The camera, just an extension of how she processed experience. She was sharp and funny, and more perceptive than the influencer persona she'd built suggested. People underestimated her because of the channel, and she let them, which was its own kind of intelligence. Eryx Halden was a friend of Thalra's from the geology department, soft-spoken, and a little adrift in a way that seemed less like distraction and more like she was always paying attention to something slightly offset from what the rest of us could see. She mentioned once, casually, that she sometimes sleepwalked, had done it since she was a kid. Nothing dramatic, just the occasional morning of waking up in a different room than she fell asleep in. Thalra told her to bring an extra layer in case she ended up on cold ground in the night. We all laughed. Eryx laughed too. Voss Emberlin was the one I knew least. He was a composer who had trained classically for years before abandoning that path to make long instrumental pieces based on field recordings, natural sounds reconstructed and layered into something that was music, but didn't quite sound like music. He had an extraordinary ear, the kind trained by years of listening to things other people tuned out. He could identify a bird species by a fragment of song, tell you the approximate distance of a sound source by the way it arrived in the air, hear a pitch difference between 2 notes that most people would have sworn were identical. He'd been spending time on the Oregon coast for a year, recording surf and wind and the sounds the basalt sea stacks made when waves moved through their caves. And he talked about it with an enthusiasm that was almost physical. And Naira Solis was in her 3rd year of medical school, and she watched people the way medicine trains you to watch people, cataloging without appearing to catalog, taking stock of the small things that most people's minds edit out as irrelevant: the color of someone's lips, the rate of their breathing, the tiny asymmetry in the way they're holding their weight. She'd packed a proper first aid kit and reminded everyone twice on the drive down to stay hydrated. And both times, she said it with enough warmth that nobody rolled their eyes, which is an achievement. And then Kieran, who drove the lead car and took every turn without GPS, who hummed something low under his breath the whole drive that none of us could identify, who knew a beach that didn't exist on any map and wouldn't say how he'd found it. Not really. Not in a way that answered the question. He said old survey maps. He said a field journal. He said he'd just followed the references wherever they led. Every time Jorik pressed him for specifics, Kieran would smile slightly and redirect, and Jorik would tell me about it afterward, increasingly irritated. And I kept telling Jorik that some people just find places in unusual ways. And Jorik kept saying that wasn't what bothered him. What bothered him, he said, was that Kieran never seemed curious about what we'd find. Everyone else on the trip, the whole drive down, was speculating, throwing out theories, talking about what an unmapped beach on the Oregon coast might mean, what the geology could look like, whether we might find evidence of previous camps. Kieran just drove and hummed, like a man going somewhere he'd already been. We parked on a gravel shoulder at the end of a road that had no name on any mapping app. There was a logging road from there, or the ghost of one. Decades of coastal scrub slowly digesting a scar in the land. We walked in single file with our gear. The scrub was dense enough on both sides that the path felt like a tunnel. And behind us, it closed like a seam being sewn. Sable had her camera out. Jorik's recorder was running. I was already thinking about the light. And then the trees opened, and the beach was there. Small, maybe 200 feet of dark sand in a crescent between two high walls of black basalt that jutted out into the water like the blades of something enormous. The ocean inside that crescent was very green, very clear in the shallows, going to deep black fast, and quiet. That was the first thing I registered before anything else, before the beauty of it, or the remoteness of it, or the strange unease that I would later understand had been present from the very first second. The quiet. This stretch of the Pacific is not a quiet ocean. The Oregon coast has shipwrecked hundreds of vessels and killed people in numbers that earned it the name the graveyard of the Pacific. And the sound of it on the rocks is constant and enormous. I'd heard it all the way down the logging road, but inside this crescent of basalt, the sound was muffled in a way I didn't have an explanation for. Not calm. More like the sound was being taken somewhere, like the beach was breathing it in. The sand, when we arrived, was completely unmarked. I photographed it because that's how I look at things, through a lens, because the frame helps me see. The clean sweep of dark sand above the tide line. Not a boot print, not a bird track, nothing. It was the cleanest beach I had ever stood on. I remember thinking that nobody has been here in a very long time. I remember thinking it with a feeling in my chest that I recognized as happiness. We set camp above the tide line, 2 tents and a tarp, and the light was doing something astonishing on the water, that particular gold of late August on the coast, when the sun comes in at an angle, and the surface of the ocean looks like hammered metal. Jorek said it reminded him of something he'd read about the bioluminescent plankton that bloomed in Netarts Bay, just up the coast in late summer. How on calm nights with the right conditions, the surf lit up blue from the dinoflagellates in the water, and that if conditions were right, we might see it here. Voss said he'd composed a whole piece the previous winter from field recordings of surf that sounded exactly like this place felt, and the way he said it, the way he said exactly, made me look at him for a second. He was already tapping his knee. Some internal rhythm his fingers were working out, the way musicians do. I left camp to shoot the water, and that's when I first noticed what the water was doing. I know how a Pacific tidal shore behaves. I've spent 4 years watching it. And 60 yards out past the break, there was a ripple running against the outgoing wave. Not with it. Against it, back toward shore. The way water moves when something large below the surface has shifted. I stood and watched, and it happened again 2 minutes later. A long, slow push against the direction the tide was pulling everything else. I thought about Thor's well down at Cape Perpetua, the collapsed sea cave where the ocean fills and drains with a force that seems to defy the direction of the tide. I thought about submerged geology disrupting current. I took 3 photographs of the spot where I'd seen it and told myself that was sufficient, and went back to help with the fire. Thaura had found stones. 4 of them lined up on a flat piece of driftwood near her tent, smooth and dark and warm, faintly warm, even though she'd found them in the shade. I asked her where they'd come from. She pointed toward the eastern rock face. I went and looked. Solid basalt, no loose material, no shingle, no scattered stone of any kind. The beach was dark, compacted sand all the way to the rocks on both sides. When I came back and told her that she studied her stones for a while, and then looked at the water and didn't say anything, which from Thaura was its own kind of statement. Kieran had the fire going in under 5 minutes, which I noted, and then didn't examine, not yet. He walked directly to the driftwood without searching, as if he knew where it was. Jorek made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh when he saw it, and then went quiet. Dinner was good. Instant noodles and trail mix, and the good chocolate Naira had brought. And for a while, it felt like every camping trip I'd ever loved. The fire, the dark water beyond it, the stars beginning to come through above the basalt. Sable was filming everyone in turn, doing her narration in the warm, practiced voice she used for her channel. And then she turned the camera toward the ocean. She frowned, checked the lens. Spotless. Checked her settings. All correct. She pointed the camera back at the group, clear and sharp. She pointed it at the water, static. Not sensor noise, not the faint grain of a low-light image. Static, rolling and thick, the kind you'd see on a television picking up nothing. She lowered the camera and stared at it, and then said, "Probably the salt air messing with something," and laughed, and turned the camera back toward the fire, and didn't aim it at the water again that night. Jorek had his earbuds in, running playback on the evening's recording, rewinding and playing short sections the way he did when he heard something he wanted to understand. I asked if he'd caught anything. He pulled one earbud out and said there was a tone underneath the ambient, constant, very low, not wind resonating through rock. He knew that sound, something else. He said he'd have to look at the waveform to be sure what it was. He put the earbud back in. Voss went quiet at some point after dinner. He'd been talking the whole time up until then, jumping between subjects with his usual scattered energy. And then he just stopped mid-sentence and sat looking at the fire. His hand was still moving on his knee. The rhythm his fingers were tapping had shifted since I'd noticed it earlier, and I realized, sitting there in the firelight with the quiet ocean behind us, that the rhythm was the same as the waves coming to shore. Exactly the same. Not close. Exactly. Naira noticed. I saw her watching him from across the fire with an expression she wasn't quite managing to keep clinical. I went to sleep around 11, with nothing I could name as wrong. Nothing beyond the water that moved wrong, and the stones with no origin, and the sound Jorik couldn't identify. All of which felt like things that would have explanations in the morning. I was 26, and I'd spent 4 years finding unusual places on the Oregon coast, and I had explanations for everything I'd found so far. I lay in the tent and listened to the muffled water and told myself I was tired and fell asleep. I woke up at 2:30 in the morning, and I didn't know why. No sound I could identify. No movement in the tent. I lay still with the particular alertness of someone whose body has woken them for a reason that hasn't announced itself yet. And then I heard the tent zip open. Quiet, but not quiet enough. I looked over. Thalra was moving through the tent door. I said her name. She sat down just outside, cross-legged, her back to me, and I could see in the moonlight that she had one of her stones in her hand. I called her again. She turned her head, and her face in the moonlight was completely composed. Not peaceful, not sleepy, not anything. Composed the way a surface is composed, like something flat that has no inside. She said she just needed air. I watched her until my eyes started to drift, and then I don't know when she came back in, because the next thing I knew was the gray light of morning, and the tent door was zipped, and she was in her sleeping bag with her back to me. And I lay there for a long time before I could make myself get up. What I didn't know until morning, what Jorik told me while we were standing in front of the footprints, was that he'd been awake at that same time. He'd heard something outside his tent that he described as footsteps on wet sand, the specific sound of something heavy moving on packed sand near the water. He'd unzipped his tent and looked out. No one was there. The sand around both tents was dry and clean. He'd stood in the tent door and looked at the ocean for a long time, and the tide was going out, and something in the surf line kept pushing forward against the receding water, a pressure moving toward the beach instead of away from it, rhythmic and slow, the same thing 3 times while he watched. He stood there until it stopped. He did not film it. He said he kept thinking he was about to, and then just didn't. He said it the way people describe something they did in a dream. The action almost happening, and then not, without explanation. Nobody talked about any of it, not right away. Because when I came out of the tent at 6 in the morning, and the sky was still gray and flat, I stopped thinking about what Jorik had seen, and what Thalra had done, and what the water had been doing. And I stood in front of the footprints, and for a long time couldn't think about anything else. They covered the sand from the waterline all the way to 30 feet from the tents. Dozens of them, maybe more, leading out of the water and up the beach and stopping. Not into the water, out of it. All of them outbound from the ocean, up the dark sand toward where we slept. The impressions were deep, the depth of something heavy for its size, and they were narrow, in a way that was close to human, but not close enough. The geometry of them just slightly wrong, in a way that your eye caught before your brain could name it. I stood there for a long time trying to name it. I think what was wrong was the weight distribution. Whatever made these prints carried itself differently than a person does. The pressure in the wrong part of the foot, leaning in a direction that doesn't match the mechanics of how a human body moves forward. I took photographs until my hands were steady, and then I went and woke Jorik, and I watched his face when he saw them, and I felt better and worse at the same time. Better because he saw the same thing I saw. Worse because Jorik was the one who was supposed to find the explanation. He stood in front of the prints for a long time, and then he got his recorder out and pointed it at the water, and stood there for 5 solid minutes in the early gray light. What he captured in those 5 minutes, he wouldn't play for me until later, but he heard it through his earbuds in real time, standing at the edge of the camp with his recorder pointed at the ocean. And when he lowered it, his expression had changed in a way that I didn't have a word for. He looked like a man who has just heard something that made a very large part of his framework for the world creak under the weight. The others came out one by one, and we all stood there and looked at the prints, and no one said the thing that everyone was thinking. Thalra walked past us without speaking, and went to the waterline and crouched at the edge of the nearest track and looked at it for a long time, running her fingers along the lip of the impression without touching the inside. Her face was the same as it had been the night before, in the moonlight. Composed. Flat. I watched her and felt the first real fear of the trip, not of the prints, but of the fact that Thalra, who noticed everything, was responding to them with nothing. Sable filmed the prints, and the footage was clean and clear. And then she tilted the frame toward the water, and the static came back, worse than the night before. She tilted back to the prints, and it cleared. She filmed what she could from angles that excluded the ocean entirely, and didn't say much about it. Eryx came out of the other tent last. She looked like she hadn't slept. She looked like she'd been somewhere that sleep doesn't reach. When Nira asked her, she said she thought she'd slept fine, but both her feet were wet, not damp, wet. And there was sand on the tops of her feet, not just the soles. The specific way sand accumulates when water moves back and forth over your feet multiple times. The tide had come up to within 20 yards of the tents in the night, and not further. Eryx looked down at her feet when Nira pointed it out, and said nothing for a moment, and then said she must have walked in her sleep. She said it like she was reading the words off a wall she couldn't see clearly. Kieran looked at the prints with an expression I've spent months trying to describe. He stood in front of them for maybe 30 seconds, and his face did not do surprise. Not the absence of surprise, like someone forcing themselves to seem calm. The genuine article. He looked at several hundred footprints leading out of the ocean toward where we'd slept, the same way you look at a road you knew would eventually get you where you were going. Like something arrived rather than something wrong. I let about 30 seconds go by, and then I asked him, in front of everyone, if we should leave. He looked at me. Something moved in his face that I might have called regret if I'd had more information. He said, "I don't think it matters yet." I said, "What does that mean?" He said he was going to start a fire for breakfast. We stayed. I still don't know how to explain that. We had footprints covering the camp from an unknown source. We had a beach that didn't exist on any map. We had a member of the group who had apparently walked into the ocean in her sleep. And we made breakfast and ate it, and the day went forward. Looking back, I think the beach had something to do with it. I think the particular quality of that place, the way it muffled sound and made the world outside the basalt walls feel very far away, made leaving feel like an idea from somewhere else, something that applied to other circumstances. Inside that crescent of rock, everything that would normally compel urgency felt theoretical. I know how that sounds. I'm telling you what I experienced. Thalra found more stones through the morning. She found them in places where there was nothing to find them, in flat, clean sand, in the shadow of the driftwood pile, in the space between the tents. By noon, she had 9 of them. Each one was smooth, each one was faintly warm, and when I photographed all 9 together and zoomed in, I could see that the surface texture was the same on every single one. Fine, shallow grooves, consistent and regular, covering the entire face of each stone. Too consistent for natural erosion, too consistent for coincidence. I showed Thalra, and she looked at the image for a long time and said she thought they were naturally formed. She said it quietly. She said it like someone who says a thing because the alternative is not something they're ready to say in daylight on a beach with other people around. Jorik found me after lunch with his recorder and with the expression he'd been wearing since the prince. And he played me the segment from 2:30 in the morning. I have tried to describe what I heard, and I don't think I've managed it yet. The closest I can get is this. Underneath the sound of the ocean, there were voices, not words. The shape of speech, the cadence and rise and fall of it, the thing conversation sounds like, heard through several walls. But there was no breath in it, no pause between phrases, no hesitation, no intake before a new thought, just the sounds, one after another, going through the motions of language with none of the biology that language requires. It sounded like something running through combinations, like something that had listened to enough human speech to know what speech was supposed to sound like, and was now trying out the architecture of it, testing which sounds went where, learning the form before it had the content. Jorik said he'd been listening to it for hours. He said the first 10 times he was convinced it was us at the campfire, that the recorder had caught a fragment of our conversation through some acoustic trick. But the rhythm was wrong, and the sounds were wrong, and once he really listened, he couldn't hear it as human anymore. He said it sounded like a rehearsal. Voss didn't come to lunch. We found him standing ankle deep in the water, eyes closed, arms loose at his sides, his whole body moving in a slow sway that matched the rhythm of the surf exactly. The same rhythm his fingers had been tapping all day, all night, since shortly after we'd arrived. Naira called his name, and he opened his eyes and smiled and said he was thinking. She walked him back up the beach, and he came willingly and easily, and kept his face turned toward the water the whole way. His fingers never stopped moving. That night, Naira came to find me alone. She'd been tracking the group all day the way medicine trains you to track, and she told me what she'd found with the careful, controlled calm of someone who is afraid and is choosing not to be afraid yet. Jorik's temperature was running a degree low. Not alarming in isolation, she said, but not what it was yesterday. Thalra's pulse had dropped since the previous morning. Lyrix's hands were cold in warm air, cold the way hands get cold when blood is moving away from the extremities, the body prioritizing the core. And Voss. She paused when she got to Voss. When she'd checked his pupils in the afternoon light, they were responding differently to each other. One reacting to light normally, one lagging slightly behind. She said she didn't know what was causing it. She said she wanted to leave at first light, and she said it with a particular steadiness of someone who has already made their own decision and is now just making sure someone else knows. I said we'd go in the morning. She nodded and went back to the tent, and I sat by the dying fire and looked at the water. The water was doing something new. The muffled quality had changed, the way the beach had been absorbing sound since we arrived, and in its place, there was a low tone that I could feel in my chest more than I could hear with my ears. Not loud, just present, constant, below the threshold of something you'd describe to another person as a sound. Voss was sitting nearby, looking at the water, and he was humming. I hadn't heard him start. He was matching the tone exactly, the same pitch, the same slow pulse, his eyes half closed, and his body still for the first time since we'd arrived. I said his name. He said, in a way that wasn't really a response. I said Voss. He looked at me and blinked and said he was just listening. I don't know when Sable got the footage. She showed it to me quietly, away from the others, around midnight, after the fire had gone to coals. One clear frame, less than a second, before the static consumed it. In the frame, at the edge of the firelight, where it reached the waterline, just below the surface, a shape. Long and absolutely still. Horizontal, maybe 15 to 20 feet from shore. And at the top of it, where it was closest to the surface, angled upward, something that caught the firelight and returned it in a way that made the shape of a face looking up. Not a human face, but face-shaped. The face-shaped thing was pointed at the camp. She closed the preview screen, and neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said she wanted to leave right now, tonight, without waiting for morning. I said we needed the light to navigate the logging road. And she said she knew. And she stood there on the dark beach, looking toward the tents. And I could see her thinking about whether the logging road in the dark was worse than one more night. We went to the tents, and we started packing quietly, and the others, one by one, woke and understood and started packing too. Nobody asked who had decided. It was just clear. We moved by headlamp with a low tone in our chests, and the still water behind us, filling packs, rolling sleeping bags, working with the specific focused efficiency of people who want to be somewhere else as quickly as possible without running. At 10 minutes past 5, the sky went from black to gray-blue. We had almost everything packed, and Naira said quietly, "Where's Kieran?" His tent was unzipped, sleeping bag inside, rolled out neatly, not slept in looking, arranged deliberately. His boots outside the tent door, side by side, pointed at the water. His pack was gone. We called his name. The beach did what it had always done with sound, absorbed it, swallowed it. We called toward the rocks, and the ocean returned nothing. I walked to the waterline and stood at the edge of the surf in the gray morning light and looked out at the water, which was flat and without motion in the distance between the basalt walls. And I want to describe what I felt standing there, but I've tried many times, and the words don't carry it. What I can tell you is that it was the feeling of being observed, but scaled to something I have no natural reference for. Not a person watching you, not even an animal. Something with a scale of attention and patience that made human watchfulness feel like nothing, like a lit match held up to the sun. Something enormous and calm and completely aware of me in a way that had been building since the moment we arrived on this beach, had been learning me the whole time, and was now at a stage in its process where my leaving or staying made very little difference because it had what it came for. I stepped back from the water. My heart was going very fast, and my legs moved me back up the beach without me deciding to move them. We walked up the logging road in single file, the same order as when we'd arrived. Eryx watched her feet the whole way. Jorik carried his recorder and didn't turn it on. Voss had stopped tapping somewhere in the last hour, and the absence of the sound was something I kept noticing the way you notice a smell that's gone. Thalra had all 9 stones in her jacket pockets and walked with her hands pressed against them from outside. Sable had her camera in her bag. Naira was counting us. I watched her do it, silently, every couple of minutes, touching each person with her eyes. I understood why. The scrub closed behind us. The sound of the ocean came back all at once, the real sound of it, loud and cold and vast, and after 3 days of the muffled quiet of the beach, it hit like a door opening onto something enormous. We walked to the cars, and we drove north, and nobody spoke for the first hour. In the weeks that followed, I checked every mapping service I could find: satellite view, terrain view, historical aerial photography going back to 1943. That section of the Tillamook coast showed an unbroken face of basalt and coastal scrub, with no beach, no crescent, no gap in the rock. I had GPS coordinates embedded in my camera's metadata. I had Jorik's recordings. I had Naira's notes. I had 237 photographs. 3 weeks later, Jorik and I drove back, both of us needing to see it or not see it, needing the question answered. The logging road was there. The walk through the scrub was there. The same tunnel of vegetation, the same damp ground underfoot. At the end of it, rock. Solid basalt dropping straight into churning water far below. No ledge, no sand, no crescent, no space where anything could have been. We stood there for a while, and neither of us said what we were thinking, and we drove home. Cairn Dovek. I've looked the way you look for a person when you're not sure what name to put on the report. He existed in everyone's life at exactly the edges. A contact from a course that no one could name specifically. A friend of a friend, where the friend wasn't sure how they'd met him. His apartment was cleared out professionally and thoroughly 2 days after the trip. His landlord confirmed he'd given notice the week before we left. His phone number disconnected. His accounts gone. No one knew his family. No one could name his hometown. The more I pulled on the thread of Cairn Dovek, the more I found a shape where a person had been rather than a person. The outline of someone who had been present in everyone's life in exactly the amount required to get 8 people to drive 4 hours to a beach that didn't exist and stay there for 3 days. 4 months after the trip, I tracked down the naturalist's journal. I'd been looking since Kieran first described it, and I finally found it through a university archive, a physical copy, a slim, hard-bound field notebook from 1912. The entry about the beach is real, exactly as Kieran described it. The coordinates, the description, the reflective quality, the sensation of being studied in return. But Kieran had not told me about the entry 2 pages before it. The earlier entry was dated 3 days prior. The naturalist wrote that he had camped on a beach near the same coordinates and woken in the morning to find the sand covered in tracks leading out of the water, dozens of them, the impressions not quite right in a way he struggled to name. He wrote that he had felt watched throughout the previous night, though he had seen nothing. He wrote that one member of his party had walked into the ocean at some hour before dawn and had no memory of it in the morning. He wrote that he intended to leave at first light. The journal entry marked as the last one, the entry about the reflective quality and the profound stillness and the sensation of being studied, is dated the morning he planned to leave. It ends mid-sentence, not at the bottom of a page, in the middle of one. Voss stopped tapping 3 weeks after we got back and hasn't done it since. He says the period around the camping trip is foggy for him, soft at the edges, the way certain memories go when you've been sick or when something has put too much stress on the system all at once. He says he's been having trouble with composition since. He says he keeps hearing a tone underneath everything he writes that he can't get rid of, that doesn't belong in the piece, that he can't identify the source of. Lyrics doesn't sleepwalk anymore. She told me this like it was good news. She said she'd been doing it since she was 7 years old, her whole life, and now she sleeps straight through every night. She said it like it was good news, and I nodded, and I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that something that has been part of a person their entire life doesn't just stop. And if it stops, it's because something stopped it, and I didn't know what had stopped it or what it had learned first. Thalra still has the stones, 10 of them now. There were 9 when we left. She can't account for the 10th one, and she stopped trying to a few months ago. She's run every geological test available to her through the university lab, and nothing has returned a clean result. The spectrometer errors on each sample, the mineral composition doesn't match anything in any reference database she can access. She photographs them every 2 weeks. She sent me the most recent photograph last month, and I looked at it for a long time before I could put my phone down. The 10th stone is slightly larger than the others. The grooves on its surface are deeper, and the grooves on the original 9, the ones she's been photographing since the trip, are deeper than they were in the first photographs. They are changing. Slowly, but they are changing, and she has not touched them with anything that could have caused that. And then there's my photograph, the one I took the first night at 10:30 in the evening, standing at the tent door, my last frame before I went to sleep. I didn't look at it until 3 weeks after the trip, when I was going through the full catalog. It's a long exposure shot of the camp, 10 seconds, the fire, the tents, the dark beach, the water beyond, and at the waterline, at the boundary, where the firelight gave out and the dark took over, there is a figure, standing completely still, facing the camp, at the edge of visibility. The posture is upright. The proportions are close to human. I have looked at this image hundreds of times, trying to find the piece of driftwood, the particular stump or rock formation that the long exposure and the low light could have assembled into that shape. I have not found it. I don't know how long it was standing there. The exposure was 10 seconds, and it didn't move during those 10 seconds because there's no motion blur, which means it was standing still in that position for at least 10 seconds, facing the camp, while we sat around the fire 20 feet behind me and talked about bioluminescent plankton and the best route home and what we wanted to eat when we got back to Portland. There's one more thing. The night before we left, at around 3 in the morning, Voss said something that I keep coming back to. We were all awake, sitting around the dead fire, and Voss was looking at the water, and his face had that smoothed out quality it had been developing for 2 days, and he said, "The way you say something you're repeating rather than saying for the first time," he said, "it's almost ready. That's all." Nobody asked him what was almost ready, because I think we all understood that asking would mean hearing an answer. I've thought about it every day since. The footprints led out of the water, not into it. Every single one of them, out of the water and up toward the camp. And something I've been sitting with for 8 months now is the question of what something that lives in the water needs 3 days to learn before it feels ready to walk out of it. What it needs to study. What it's practicing when it stands at the edge of a camp at 10:30 at night, staying perfectly still in the cold, while the people it's watching sit by a fire 20 feet away, talking about ordinary things. What it means when it says, through a voice recorder, through a medium it's been learning to use, "How do you hold a face still?" I don't go near the ocean at night anymore. I've tried to explain this to people who weren't there, and the best I can do is this. I'm not afraid of what's in the water. I'm afraid of what learned how to not be in the water anymore. I'm afraid of how long it had been practicing. I'm afraid of the figure in my photograph that stood still for 10 seconds in the dark, with a posture that was almost right. I'm afraid that almost is the part that's been improving.